Hello, this is Dr. James Camp from Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is my introduction to the cardiovascular system. Today we're going to look at the general functions of the cardiovascular system, the essential components of any circulatory system, the major blood flow circuits, and the functions of each component of the cardiovascular system. Okay, so what are the functions of the cardiovascular system? Perhaps most famously, the cardiovascular system is a transportation network, a circulation network. And it circulates oxygen to your tissues and cells, and then carbon dioxide back from your tissues and cells. But it also circulates various other things. Nutrients and electrolytes, also known as minerals, and also certain waste products that your tissues and cells produce in the course of metabolism are circulated by the cardiovascular system back to the liver and back to the kidneys where they can be gotten rid of. Finally, there are certain other things that the cardiovascular system circulates, such as hormones and antibodies that are always present in the blood, though to different amounts. Hormones, of course, are present when that hormonal signal is needed. Antibodies are present when a particular disease is detected. The cardiovascular system is also useful for regulation. One of the ways in which the cardiovascular system regulates our body is that it controls the distribution of body temperature. As you recall from our unit in the integumentary system in A&P 1, body temperature is controlled in part by circulating more blood to the surface of the skin if you want to lose heat, keeping that blood away from the surface of the skin if you want to retain heat. And so by controlling where we circulate blood, we control body temperature. Another important function of the blood is pH regulation, also known as buffering. The blood contains an important carbonate bicarbonate buffer that we'll come back to in the respiratory system and the urinary system. We'll revisit this a couple of times because it's a very important topic. And finally, the cardiovascular system has to regulate itself by controlling blood pressure. Okay, blood pressure regulation will be a major topic in this unit. Finally, there is one other function of the cardiovascular system, and that is protection. White blood cells or leukocytes help form the immune system. Antibodies and other immune molecules that circulate in the blood also constitute the immune system. And then platelets and proteins protect against blood loss. Okay, proteins called clotting factors. And we'll talk a lot about the protection against blood loss, known as hemostasis, stop the bleeding in Latin, later in this chapter. Or actually, that'll be talked about in next chapter on blood. Okay, so I always like to start by explaining that circulatory systems are not just blood. There are circulatory systems that we encounter in our sort of everyday lives all over the place. One kind of odd example I like to give is that my house is home to a number of fish who live in an aquarium. And in that aquarium, we have a certain amount of water, obviously, or the fish wouldn't be able to live, right? That water has to be kept clean. It has to be kept oxygenated. And so there's a little black box that sits here on the side of my fish tank that has a pipe that goes down into the water to pull water in, and then it has a motor inside that drives that water up through a filter element, which we'll color yellow here, to clean the water, and then that water spills out back into the fish tank, picking up in training oxygen as it goes. Okay. So we have a couple of functions in one here. We've got a filter that is cleaning the water, and we have a waterfall that is pulling oxygen, fresh oxygen, into the water so that the various fish can live happily ever after. Okay. What are the elements of this circulatory system? Well, I mentioned that there was a pump in here that draws the water through the device. There is a filter there is that waterfall unit, and there is this pipe that pulls the water into the circulatory system in the first place. Another one you may or may not have ever given much thought to is if you're dealing with a car engine, or in my case a motorcycle engine or something like that. It's got its several cylinders here that move up and down to make the engine go round and round. And they generate lots of heat as they do their job, because the way an engine works is to set fire to gasoline, and that's obviously going to generate heat. So we've got to have we have a radiator here somewhere towards the front of the car or the motorcycle, and we're going to take cool water and antifreeze coolant mixture, okay, and pass it over this engine block until it is hot, and then we'll take it back to the radiator and circulate it through to cool it down again. Okay. Somewhere in here, there's also a little, there's got to be a water pump. I'll go with my green color from earlier, that forces this coolant to circulate through the system. And there's probably also a water reservoir, sort of a tank here that holds the coolant until it when it's not actively being circulated through the engine. So again, what are some features we have here? We have again a pump. We don't have a filter or a waterfall this time. We have a radiator and an engine block, one of them generating heat, one of them losing heat. But we do still have a series of pipes or hoses that carry the circulating coolant around and around and around. We can think of lots of other examples of circulatory systems. The air conditioning system in your house circulates coolant between that big piece out next to your house, with the little fan on top that pulls air through and cools your coolant. And then that refrigerant circulates up in my house. It goes to the attic, and there's an air blower machine that takes warm air and puts out cool air that can then be circulated through the house. But then that generates warm refrigerant that has to go back to the cooler outside the outside unit, the compressor. And so there's got to be a pump somewhere that pushes this coolant through the system, and there are pipes that carry the coolant back and forth. And then there are these units, the compressor, they call it, and I don't know what they would call this, maybe a furnace or something. Okay. So what do we see? We notice that all of these systems have a pump, all of these systems have a pipe, and all of these systems have a fluid that has to circulate through them. So those are the three parts of any circulatory system. We're going to have pipes, we're going to have pumps, and we're going to have fluids. There are actually two circulatory systems in your body. The cardiovascular system is what we're going to focus on in this unit. The lymphatic system, which is a sort of secondary circulation, we'll talk about in the next unit. So while we're on the topic of pumps, pipes, and fluids, I just want to bring up the fact that I learned chemical engineering before I learned anatomy and physiology. And in chemical engineering, we do a lot of pumps, pipes, and fluids. And we're trained to take a kind of scary looking picture of a chemical plant with its various columns and tanks and pipes running all over the place, and turn it into a picture like this, where you see, okay, well, here's the tower, and there's another tower, and there's a pump, there are several pumps, and all the lines going this way and that are pipes. Well, when I learned biomedical engineering, we found that we could do the same thing with the body. The first thing you do is you start with the pretty textbook picture of the circulatory system, which shows the two sides of the heart. One of them pushes blood through the lungs. One of them pushes blood through the rest of the body. Well, we can take that and we can separate out the right side of the heart as one pump, and the left side of the heart as another pump. Because they do, in fact, actually work independently of each other. Blood flows through the right heart, and then goes to the lungs, and then goes to the left heart. Blood never flows from right to left inside the heart. Okay, if there's nothing else you learn from this lecture, blood never flows from right to left inside the heart. So then we can draw all the pipes, as I had in my previous drawing of the chemical plant, as just little arrows. So each of these arrows represents a blood vessel, or sometimes a collection of blood vessels, a blood flow path, you might say. So we have, coming out of the right heart, we have the pulmonary trunk here, and then we have the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery, and then we get to the right lung and the left lung. Now, in chemical engineering, we sometimes draw these little diagonal arrows to indicate that this unit, this unit called a lung, is interacting with the outside world. It's not just circulating blood. So what's passing through the lungs that's making a difference here is air. Okay, so we're adding oxygen, turning the blood red, and at the same time taking out carbon dioxide. So we're exchanging those things with the air. Then we have the pulmonary veins, which bring blood back to the left side of the heart, which pushes blood into a giant blood vessel called the aorta. And then from there, blood goes pretty much all over the body. Some blood, which is not drawn here, actually goes back to the heart, the coronary arteries, the coronary circulation, because the heart itself needs a blood supply. But then we have the cerebral circulation takes blood up to the brain. Okay. We don't have a name for the circulation that goes to the upper limbs, but there's a circulation that goes to the upper limbs. There's a circulation that goes down to the lower limbs, and one that goes to various other organs in your body, the spleen, the kidneys get their own. The renal circulation carries blood to the kidneys, and that's worth noting because we have another exchange here. Okay, this is with a fluid called urine. Okay, we produce urine in the kidneys, and that subtracts from our blood volume. It actually takes water out of our blood along with other things. So this is a place where we alter the blood somewhat. The other place where we alter the blood is in the GI tract, where we bring in food. Okay, we can add water to our blood volume here. We can also add nutrients and vitamins and minerals. And we can also add other things, though. We can add toxins. We can add bacteria and viruses can come in through our GI tract because our food is not always clean and sterile. And so the blood from our GI tract has to go to the liver for cleaning before it can go on to the rest of the body. So we'll find when we study the circulatory, as we study the circulatory system, that's what we're doing now, that the hepatic portal circulation makes sure that all the food that's been absorbed in the GI tract gets circulated to the liver before it goes back to the heart and all over the body again. So that's a general plan of the circulation. Let's look real quickly at the names for the different pieces here. Any circulatory system, as I said, has three parts: pipes, pumps, and fluids. The fluids we're going to put off to studying in the next unit on fluid tissues. We'll study the blood at the same time that we study the lymph and the immune system. But we are in this chapter going to study arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins, the pipes. Okay, an artery. An artery is the name for a blood vessel that leaves the heart. A vein.
Oh, I know what an artery is. Isn't it a part in the heart?
Arteries carry blood away from the heart. You're thinking atria. Those are parts of the heart. Veins carry blood back to the heart. Capillaries are the ones that circulate blood into through one of your organs, where oxygen and carbon dioxide and nutrients and waste products and all of those things can exchange between the blood and your organ. In between arteries and capillaries are arterioles. In between capillaries and veins are venules. The pumps. A pump creates pressure, which pushes the fluid forward. There are several pumps in our body, but the ones that we're going to study most in this are the right heart and the left heart, which, as my son was just pointing out, each have two parts, an atrium and a ventricle. And blood comes in from the veins to the atrium, and it goes out of the ventricle back to the arteries. And so that's what makes this a circulatory system, is we end up with a closed loop there. Veins to atrium, to ventricle, to arteries, and then through again to more veins. Okay. Last but not least, the functions of the cardiovascular organs. The heart has to do basically four major things. Its major job is it has to contract to produce the blood pressure that causes the blood to flow. A secondary part of that is it has to allow the flow of blood in one direction only. And as a result, the heart has these very important structures called valves. It has to modify its rate of contraction, heart rate, and contraction force to regulate two things: blood pressure and cardiac output. Blood pressure, we all know. Cardiac output is the rate at which blood is flowing from the heart, coming out of the heart to the rest of the body. And finally, the heart has to secrete a blood pressure hormone called ANP. The A means atrial, and that means it comes from the atria of the heart. We'll talk about the regulation of blood pressure more in this unit as we get to the physiology part. Blood vessels also have some important functions. The most important function is that they have to carry blood around the body. Okay, I guess that's pretty obvious. That's what blood vessels are built for. At the level of capillaries, they have to allow exchange of gases and nutrients so that oxygen can get to your tissues, oxygen can get into your blood from the lungs, etc. And finally, the blood vessels have to be able to constrict, both to control blood flow. We'll talk about that in the blood vessel anatomy lecture, and to regulate blood pressure. We'll talk about that in the physiology unit. Okay, and that brings us to next up. The next lecture you'll tune into is the cardiac anatomy and histology lecture, which I will have up very, very soon now.